Why did the entire parade stop for just one man? The question hung in the air unspoken, yet heavy as the sound of drums faded into silence. Soldiers had been marching in perfect unison, boots striking pavement with the rhythm of discipline and power, banners snapping in the sharp spring wind. Crowds roared, waving flags, their eyes fixed on polished metals glinting under the sun. But then something strange happened. The cheers faltered. The thunder of brass instruments quieted. All because a single figure on the far edge of the bleachers drew the gaze of the most powerful woman in the country. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't seated in the rows reserved for decorated officers. He was a man in a faded jacket, sitting low, almost hidden, with a boy clinging to his sleeve. Michael Carter shifted uncomfortably on the cold metal bench, trying to make himself smaller. He hated these crowds, hated the feeling of being swallowed, invisible, yet judged all the same. He hadn't wanted to come, but Ethan had begged him, bouncing with excitement about tanks and jets, about soldiers in crisp uniforms, and the thrill of seeing the commander-in-chief herself. So he came for his boy. Ethan, just 8 years old, leaned close now, tugging at his sleeve, whispering the question that stabbed sharper than any blade. "Dad, why isn't anyone looking at you?" Michael's jaw flexed, the muscles tightening against the ache that lived there. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the polished convoys rolling past, generals sitting proud and tall, bathed in applause. He remembered what it felt like to ride in one of those vehicles years ago, to feel the weight of the flag on his shoulder, the cheers of strangers rolling over him like a tide. But that had been another life. He turned to Ethan, forcing a smile that didn't touch his tired eyes. "Because, buddy, today isn't about me." But Ethan frowned, his little brows knitting, lips pressed together in confusion. Children always spotted truths adults tried to bury. Michael swallowed hard and looked away. The truth was simpler. The world had forgotten him. Once he had been Staff Sergeant Michael Carter, a soldier who had carried men out of fire when the desert swallowed their screams. Once he had been the one others looked to when chaos broke. And then, just like that, it had ended. An injury, a limp, papers stamped with words like unfit and discharged. No ceremony, no farewell, no parade, just silence. Now he was a single dad, patching engines in a garage at night to make rent, scraping by, invisible. The crowd roared again as brass blared, but the sound faded in Michael's ears. He had lived long enough to know applause wasn't for people like him. And then it happened. A silence cut through the thunder of the parade like a blade. A ripple of confusion spread. He followed the hush with his eyes and saw her. Rachel Donovan, the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, a woman who carried herself with the steel of command and the quiet fire of someone who had buried her own pain. Her eyes, sharp as an eagle, swept the stands. And instead of pausing for the dignitaries in their pressed uniforms, instead of smiling at the senators and governors waiting for her nod, she stopped and looked at him. Michael froze. His heart slammed in his chest. He glanced left, then right, as if someone else must be behind him. But no, her gaze was locked on his. Boots clicked as she broke formation. She walked toward him. Cameras swung. Gasps rippled through the stands. Whispers rose. "Why him?" Michael's breath caught. Ethan's small hand gripped his tighter. His boy's eyes were wide, innocent, confused. Rachel Donovan stopped in front of them. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a single, deliberate motion, she raised her hand in a crisp salute. Michael's throat burned. His faded jacket sleeve trembled as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. For a heartbeat, he thought his legs would betray him. But he stood, and he returned the salute. His hands shook, but his eyes did not waver. And in that suspended moment, with his son staring up at him, Michael Carter was seen, not as a mechanic, not as a man discarded by the system, but as the soldier he once was. The roar that followed wasn't for tanks or brass bands. It was for him. Ethan's face lit up like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Dad, she saluted you. She saluted you." Michael managed a thin smile, though his chest ached with something more complicated than pride. "Yeah, buddy, she did." But even as applause thundered, even as strangers stood and clapped and called his name when the announcer stammered into the microphone, Michael felt something else rise in him. A sting. Shame. He hadn't asked for this. He had promised himself he would never stand in the spotlight again, not after the way his service ended, not after the choices made in that desert night. The president's eyes lingered on him just for a moment longer, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't into the microphone. It was directly to him. "You carried men out when others left them behind. We haven't forgotten." Her words struck harder than the salute. His chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold onto that moment, but he knew recognition was dangerous. Applause could turn into silence just as fast as silence could turn into blame. The parade ended, but Michael didn't remember walking home. He only remembered Ethan's voice, light and innocent. "Dad, are we famous now?" Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "Not even close, kiddo. People just noticed for once." "You deserve it," Ethan said firmly, with the conviction only a child could carry. Michael ruffled his son's hair. "I just did my job." But Ethan shook his head stubbornly. "No, you're a hero." The word pierced Michael. Hero. He thought of the night he pulled Hayes from the burning Humvee, the weight of another man's blood soaking into his uniform. He thought of Sergeant Vega, who didn't make it back. Heroes weren't the ones who walked away. Heroes were the ones buried under folded flags. That night after Ethan fell asleep, Michael sat at the kitchen table staring at a drawer. He pulled it open and revealed a small box of medals, dusty, untouched. He had never shown them to Ethan. He didn't want his boy to think honor came from ribbons. A knock at the door startled him. Two men in black stood outside, rigid professional, Secret Service. And behind them, Rachel Donovan, the president herself. Michael's breath caught. "Ma'am, may I come in?" His chest tightened. The last time anyone from the government had knocked, it had been to cut his benefits. He hesitated, but then Ethan's sleepy voice drifted from down the hall. "Dad, who's there?" Michael opened the door. Rachel stepped inside, her gaze scanning the small apartment, the peeling paint, the stack of unpaid bills, the single plate in the sink. She said nothing about it. Her eyes softened. "I owe you something," she said quietly. Michael crossed his arms. "You don't owe me a thing, ma'am. I did my duty." Rachel's jaw tightened, but her voice trembled in a way he hadn't expected. "You carried my brother out of that ambush in Kandahar. He lived long enough for us to say goodbye. That was you, wasn't it?" Michael's throat closed. The memory hit like a wave, chaos, fire, blood, the desperate weight of a man's life in his arms. He hadn't even known the soldier's name. "Yes," he whispered. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she stood tall. "My family never forgot, and today I wanted the world to remember you too." Michael looked away, swallowing the lump in his throat. Gratitude felt heavier than silence. He wasn't used to being seen. Ethan padded into the room, eyes wide. "Dad, is she the president?" Rachel smiled gently. "Yes, I am, and you must be Ethan." She knelt to his level. "Your dad saved lives. That makes you pretty special, too." Ethan beamed, chest puffed out. Rachel rose, her eyes lingering on Michael with a weight that felt like more than thanks. "You shouldn't be sitting in the shadows." When she left, silence filled the room again. Michael sat for a long time in the dim light, staring at the medals he had kept hidden. Her words gnawed at him. For years he had lived invisible. Now the commander-in-chief herself had pulled him back into the fire. He exhaled slowly, his eyes hardening, because if she remembered, others might too. And not all memories were clean. How do you explain to a child that recognition can be as dangerous as silence? Morning sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of Michael Carter's small apartment, painting pale gold across a chipped kitchen table. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. He wasn't drinking it anyway. His mind was elsewhere. Last night had cracked open something inside him, something he'd been burying for years. Ethan shuffled into the room in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. His voice was small but certain. "Dad, was it real? Did the president really come here?" Michael set the mug down and forced himself to meet his son's gaze. He wanted to shield him, to soften reality into something simple. But Ethan was sharper than most boys his age. He deserved honesty, even if it was messy. "Yeah, buddy," Michael said quietly. "It was real." Ethan grinned wide, a missing front tooth turning his smile crooked. "Then that means people are going to know you're a hero now." The word again, hero. Michael ruffled his son's hair, hiding the storm twisting in his chest. "Hero's just a word, kiddo. What matters is what we do every day, like me making sure you eat breakfast before school." Ethan giggled, but Michael saw the glow in his boy's eyes. That glow scared him. If his son believed his father was larger than life, what would happen when he learned the truth? That Michael hadn't been celebrated, that he'd been discarded, that his file had been stamped unfit, that when he had spoken about the choices that cost men their lives, command had silenced him. He turned back to his cold coffee. The silence between them was heavy, filled with truths he couldn't share. Later that week, he stood in the grocery store checkout line, uncomfortable under the stares. Ever since the salute at the parade, his face had been plastered across news clips and social media. Headlines called him the forgotten soldier. People whispered, pointed, reached out to shake his hand. He hated it. The attention felt dangerous. An older man behind him muttered just loud enough for the aisle to hear. "Not every vet deserves a salute. Some got booted out for a reason." Michael froze, his jaw locking. Shame burned in his chest. He wanted to turn, to snap back, to explain. But before he could, a soft voice spoke from nearby. "Sir," a young woman said, turning toward the man, "that soldier carried my cousin out of a burning vehicle. He didn't have to, but he did. He's the reason my family got to say goodbye." Michael's chest constricted. He turned slowly. Her eyes were familiar. He remembered them through smoke and chaos, Corporal Hayes's niece. She met his gaze with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The older man had no response. He looked away, muttering into silence. Michael nodded faintly. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said under his breath. But as he carried his groceries out to the car, the words felt hollow. He knew the truth. Not everyone would have done what he did, and not everyone would forgive what he knew. That night Ethan sat at the kitchen table, crayons scattered, drawing tanks and stick soldiers on scrap paper. His laughter filled the room, light and pure, but Michael's attention was elsewhere. On the laptop glowing in front of him. For years, buried in the bottom of his files, he had kept a copy of the after-action report from Kandahar. He told himself it was just a document, but in truth, it was a wound that never closed. The official report said the ambush had been unavoidable, a tragic accident of war. Michael remembered it differently. He remembered the warnings. He remembered the ignored intel. He remembered orders barked by men far above his rank, decisions that pushed them forward into fire. And he remembered the silence after. The dead were buried, the mistakes were covered, and Michael, broken and limping, had been easier to discard than to admit failure. He stared at the report, his hands trembling. He had stayed quiet to protect the honor of his unit, to keep Ethan's future untainted by shadows. But now, with the world watching, silence felt heavier than ever. A knock at the door jolted him. This time it wasn't Secret Service. No convoy, no polished suits, just Rachel Donovan. She wore a plain coat, her hair tied back, her eyes sharper than he'd ever seen them. She stepped inside before he could ask why. "You knew I'd come back," she said softly. Michael leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You remember more than you let on. Rachel's gaze was steady. I remember the chaos, the gunfire, my brother screaming, and I remember you dragging him out. Her voice faltered, just for a breath, then steel returned. What I don't know is why you vanished after, why your name disappeared from reports. Michael exhaled, a bitter laugh escaping. Because I told the truth, and the truth got buried. Easier to pin me as unstable, easier to discard me than admit command made mistakes. Rachel's eyes glistened, anger flashed beneath. And you carried that alone all these years. Michael nodded, his voice low. Didn't want my boy growing up hating the country I served. Rachel stepped closer. Her tone softened, but her eyes never wavered. Michael, people need to hear this. They need to know what was covered up. I can't undo what happened, but I can stand with you. He shook his head, breath ragged. I don't want revenge. I just want my son to know I didn't quit, that I wasn't forgotten. Rachel placed a steady hand on his arm. Then let's show him. Michael stared at her, the weight of years pressing down. He had been invisible, forgotten, erased. And now the most powerful woman in the nation was offering to bring his voice back into the light. The next day they stood together at a press conference. Cameras flashed. Microphones crowded forward. Ethan clutched his father's hand, eyes wide but proud. Rachel spoke first, her voice ringing clear. This man was ignored, discarded, erased from history books, not because he failed, but because he refused to stay silent when failures higher up cost lives. Today, we set the record straight. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Michael's throat tightened. His palms sweated. For a moment he almost stepped back, but then he felt Ethan's hand tighten around his. He lifted his head steady. I didn't come here for fame, Michael said, his voice low but resonant. I came because silence has weight. It crushes you until you forget who you were. But my son reminded me. And yesterday, when the commander-in-chief saluted me, she reminded me too. He glanced down at Ethan, then out at the sea of cameras. I was invisible, not anymore, not for me, not for the men we lost. Today we remember them. The applause that followed wasn't like the parade. It wasn't spectacle, it was raw, human, real. That night Michael sat on the porch with Ethan curled against his side, the city lights flickering in the distance. The boy looked up, his voice drowsy but sure. Dad, you're not invisible anymore. Michael kissed the top of his son's head, eyes stinging. No, buddy, not anymore. And in that quiet moment, for the first time in years, Michael felt peace. Not because the world saluted him, but because kindness, Rachel's, Hayes's niece, Ethan's unshaken faith, had given him back the one thing war had stolen. His voice. And sometimes, that was the greatest revenge against being forgotten. But as he looked out into the night, another thought crept in. What happens when truth spreads wider than you can control? Michael knew the report on his laptop was more than a story. It was a spark, and sparks, once set free, could burn. Why does truth feel heavier once the world hears it? Michael Carter had thought that speaking out would be the hardest part. Standing in front of flashing cameras, telling strangers about silence and scars that had taken everything in him. But he hadn't expected the silence after. The long pause that came when the applause ended and the headlines began to spread. The salute had been one moment, the press conference was another. Now came the ripples. By the next morning, Michael's name was everywhere. News networks replayed the clip on a loop. Social media split like a battlefield, some hailing him as a hero, others questioning, dissecting, twisting. Ethan found the video first on a neighbor's phone. His eyes sparkled with pride. Dad, look, they're showing you everywhere. Michael forced a smile, hiding the unease knotting in his chest. He remembered the grocery store whispers, the man muttering that not every veteran deserved respect. He remembered how easily strangers could turn admiration into suspicion. And he knew one thing for certain, The world didn't just want his story. It wanted the whole truth. But truth was dangerous. Rachel Donovan called that afternoon. Her voice carried both steel and weariness. Michael, you need to prepare yourself. Once you speak out, you can't pull the words back. I didn't give them the whole story, he muttered. There was a pause on the line. And do you plan to? She asked. Michael stared at the closed laptop on the table, the after-action report sitting inside like a coiled serpent. If I do, it won't just be about me. It'll drag names through the mud, names that families still honor, names that governments still protect. Rachel's tone softened. And if you don't, men like Vega stay buried twice, once in the ground and once in silence. Michael closed his eyes. His chest felt like it was being crushed. That night after Ethan fell asleep, Michael sat on the porch with the report open in his lap. He could see every line, every sanitized phrase, unavoidable ambush, tragic loss, no indication of failure in command decisions. He had lived through the truth. He remembered the radio warnings ignored, the intel dismissed because higher command had already decided the road was clear. He remembered the convoy pushing forward into a kill zone. He remembered pulling Hayes's body, screaming, through fire. He remembered the look in Sergeant Vega's eyes before the flames swallowed him. He remembered. But the report told another story, and the men who wrote it still wore stars on their shoulders. Michael's hands shook as he scrolled. His finger hovered over the upload button. He could send it to journalists. He could burn the lie down with a single click. But then Ethan's voice echoed in his memory. You're a hero, Dad. Would his son still see him that way if the world painted him a traitor? The decision ate at him, piece by piece. Days passed. The attention didn't fade, it grew. At the garage where he worked, customers shook his hand, sometimes leaving extra bills tucked beneath. Strangers stopped him in the street. Some thanked him. Some stared too long, and some spat words like knives. Coward. Whistleblower. Liar. He tried to hide it from Ethan, but children see more than parents think. One night, Ethan crawled onto his lap and whispered, Dad, are people mad at you? Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to lie to protect his boy, but honesty was all he had left. Some are, buddy, he admitted softly. Not everyone agrees on what's right. Ethan frowned, thinking hard. But you told the truth, right? Michael nodded, his chest aching. Yeah, I told the truth. Then they'll see it, Ethan said simply, as if it were that easy. Michael wished it were. But the storm was building. Rachel visited again unannounced, her face drawn with the strain of a leader carrying both country and conscience. She didn't sit this time. She paced. They're coming after you, Michael, she said bluntly. Not just words. I'm talking about legal action. They'll try to discredit you, tear apart your record, drag your name through the dirt. Michael leaned back in his chair, bitter laughter bubbling up. What's left to tear apart? They already buried me once. Rachel stopped packing, her eyes locked on his. You have something bigger than your name at stake now. You have your son, and you have the truth. That makes you dangerous to them. Her words sank in like stones. He glanced toward Ethan's room, where soft breathing carried through the wall. Dangerous. Not the kind of dangerous he had once been in uniform. This was different. This was quieter, but it was no less lethal. The next day, Michael returned to the grocery store. He caught the same man from before, glaring, muttering under his breath. But this time, the young woman, Hayes's niece, approached him again. She pressed a folded note into his hand. Not everyone will understand, but some of us, we remember, don't stop. Michael opened it later, sitting in his car. It wasn't long. Just a name, a phone number, and a single line written in hurried script. He was there too. He'll talk if you do. Michael stared at it for a long time. Another soldier, another witness, another voice that could crack the silence. But speaking out wasn't just about him anymore. It would drag others into the light, and light could burn. That evening he called Rachel. Her tone was taut, urgent. "I told you, Michael, once you step into this, there's no halfway." Michael hesitated. "What if I drag others down with me?" Rachel's voice softened. "Or maybe you lift them up. Maybe you give them the courage to stop hiding too." Michael sat in silence after the call ended, staring at Ethan's crayon drawings taped to the fridge. Tanks, soldiers, smiling stick figures holding hands. In a child's world, war ended with hugs. In Michael's, it ended with shadows. That night, unable to sleep, Michael opened the laptop again. His cursor hovered over the file, over the button, over the choice. He whispered to himself, voice breaking, "Am I protecting him or lying to him?" No answer came, only the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet tick of the clock, and the heavy weight of truth waiting to be set free. The next morning, Michael walked Ethan to school. Parents glanced at him, some nodding, some whispering. He ignored them all. He knelt by Ethan at the gate, smoothing his hair. "Remember, buddy, no matter what you hear, no matter what people say, I'm your dad first, always." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than he should. "I know, Dad, and you're my hero." The word again, heavy, binding. As Michael walked away, he knew something had to break. The lie, the silence, or him. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to choose which. The first irreversible step came quietly, with a single phone call. Michael Carter stared at the note Hayes's niece had given him, the name and number written in hurried scrawl. His hand hovered over the phone, trembling, his thumb brushing against the digits like they might burn him. He had spent years trying to bury the truth. Now, with one call, he could dig it back up, and there would be no burying it again. He dialed. The voice on the other end was rough, older, tired. "Carter, I wondered when you'd break." Michael's breath caught. "You were there." A pause, then a sigh heavy with memories. "Yeah, I was there, and I've been carrying it ever since." The conversation was short, but it was enough. The man confirmed what Michael already knew, that the ambush hadn't been an accident, that warnings were ignored, that orders from high above had pushed them forward into a slaughter. He wasn't alone anymore. But solidarity came with a price. By the next morning, Michael noticed the difference. A black SUV parked too long at the corner near his apartment. A stranger in a pressed shirt standing too close outside the grocery store, pretending to read the paper. At first, he told himself he was imagining it, but Rachel confirmed it with one clipped phone call. "They're watching you. They won't stop now. You're a problem that can't be ignored." Michael's jaw clenched. He looked toward Ethan, sitting cross-legged on the floor, crayons spread out, humming softly to himself. His boy had no idea that shadows were circling them both. That night, Michael tucked Ethan into bed and sat at the kitchen table with the after-action report glowing on the laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keys. Upload, share, expose. The temptation was sharp, almost intoxicating. But then came the fear. What if retaliation didn't come for him, but for Ethan? What if his boy's life was the one scarred by his choices? Sleep wouldn't come. When dawn broke, Michael was still sitting at the table, the cursor blinking like a dare. Later that day, Rachel arrived again. No entourage, no ceremony. She looked more soldier than president in a plain jacket, her hair pulled back, eyes fierce. She didn't waste words. "You can't wait forever. If you hesitate, they'll control the story. They'll control you." Michael met her gaze, his voice low. "I can handle them coming for me, but not for my son." Rachel's eyes softened just for a moment. "You think I don't know that fear? I've had to protect my family from this machine my entire career. But here's the truth, Michael. Silence won't shield him. It'll only teach him to live afraid." Her words cut deep. Michael looked at Ethan's drawings taped to the fridge, crayon tanks, smiling stick soldiers, flags. His son still believed in heroes, still believed in him. The next evening, Michael met the man from the phone call. They sat in a diner at the edge of town, the kind where the smell of fried food clung to your clothes and the waitress refilled your coffee before you asked. The man's face was lined, his eyes sunken, but the weight he carried was familiar. "Truth doesn't just set you free," the man muttered. "It chains you to it. Once you speak, there's no turning back." Michael sipped his coffee, silent. The man leaned forward. "But I'll stand with you. I won't let them bury you again." Michael nodded. The decision felt like a stone dropping into his gut. When he returned home that night, Ethan was waiting awake, eyes wide. "Dad, why are people saying bad things about you on TV?" Michael froze. The boy had heard. The storm had reached their doorstep. He knelt, pulling Ethan close. "People say things when they're scared of the truth, but I need you to know I'll never lie to you. Not about this. Not about anything." Ethan's lip trembled. "They can't take you away, right?" Michael's heart broke. He wrapped his arms tight around his son. "Not as long as I'm breathing, buddy. Not ever." But in the quiet of his own thoughts, Michael knew promises were fragile. Shadows were closing in, and every choice he made now would decide not just his fate, but Ethan. The next morning, Michael opened his laptop again. His fingers didn't tremble this time. He uploaded the report, sent it to 3 journalists, and hit send. The choice was made. For better, for worse, for truth. What happens after you press send? For Michael Carter, it was silence first. A long, hollow pause where nothing seemed to change. He sent the report to 3 journalists, one independent, one mainstream, one veteran blogger who had been screaming into the void for years. After that, all he could do was wait. But silence never lasts. The first story broke less than 48 hours later. A grainy headline on a website most people ignored. "Leaked report contradicts official account of Kandahar ambush." It didn't use his name yet, but it quoted the document line for line. By that evening, his phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters outside his building. Camera crews on the street. The old SUV parked at the corner never left. And then came the backlash. The morning news anchors wore the practiced faces of professionals trained to look calm while stoking fire. Some hailed him as a whistleblower, a soldier brave enough to expose corruption. Others painted him as a bitter veteran, a man trying to rewrite history because he couldn't handle his discharge. One network called him unstable. Another accused him of jeopardizing national security. Words cut sharper than bullets when repeated on every screen. Ethan heard them too. "Dad," he whispered one night, clutching his blanket, "why are people saying you're bad?" Michael's chest ached. He sat on the edge of the bed, brushing his son's hair back. "Because telling the truth makes people nervous, buddy. Some people want to believe the world is simple. When you remind them it's not, they get scared. And scared people say things they do mean." Ethan's eyes glistened in the dim light. "But you're not bad. You saved people. You saved me." Michael pulled him close. "That's all that matters. You remember that, no matter what they say." But when Ethan finally drifted into sleep, Michael sat in the dark, staring at the wall. Words might not break him, but they could break his son. The next day, Rachel Donovan appeared at his door again, her face tight, her eyes scanning the street before she stepped inside. She looked less like a president now and more like the soldier she had once been. "They're moving fast," she said, her voice low. "Command's furious. The Pentagon's already trying to discredit the leak, but they know it's real, and they know where it came from." Michael leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Let them come. I'm not running anymore." Rachel's gaze softened. "This isn't just about you anymore. They'll try to silence anyone connected to this, me included, and your son." Michael's heart lurched. "Leave him out of this." "I'm trying," she said firmly. "But you need to understand what you've started. The truth doesn't walk alone. It drags shadows behind it." He wanted to argue, but the words died in his throat. He already knew. By the end of the week, the firestorm was everywhere. Reporters shouted his name when he left the apartment. Strangers slipped notes under his door, some thanking him, some threatening him. One night as Michael walked Ethan home from school, he noticed a man across the street watching. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. Michael's hand tightened around Ethan's shoulder. He quickened their pace. His instincts screamed. That man wasn't a reporter, he wasn't curious. He was measuring, calculating. For the first time since the desert, Michael felt hunted. Back at the apartment, he double-checked the locks. He tried to hide the tension from Ethan, but children sensed danger. Ethan stayed close, unusually quiet, watching his father's every move. That night, Michael sat alone at the kitchen table, the glow of the laptop casting shadows across his face. More outlets had picked up the story. More soldiers were starting to reach out anonymously, whispering truths that matched his own. It was spreading. But so were the threats. His phone buzzed, a black number, a voice calm, almost polite. "You should think of your boy, Sergeant. Truth is a luxury. Family is survival. Pick one." The line went dead. Michael stared at the phone, his pulse hammering. He wanted to throw it against the wall. Instead, he sat still, forcing his breath steady. When Rachel called the next morning, he didn't tell her about the threat. He didn't need to. She already knew. "They're going to try to scare you quiet," she said. "You can't let them win." Michael's voice cracked with bitterness. "You ever had to tuck your kid in while wondering if tonight's the night someone comes through the door?" Rachel's silence on the other end was long. When she finally spoke, her words were heavy. "Every night. That's what it means to stand in front. And it's why most people never do. But Michael, if you back down now, they'll teach your son that truth only matters when it's easy. Do you want that?" Michael closed his eyes. He could hear Ethan's voice in memory, small but fierce. "But you told the truth, right?" "Yes," Michael had said, and he couldn't take that back. He wouldn't. Later that week, he met Rachel in a secure office downtown. She looked at him across the table, her hands folded, her face drawn. "They're going to drag you into hearings," she warned. "Closed doors, harsh questions, they'll try to break you." Michael almost laughed. "I've already been broken. What else can they do?" Rachel leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "They can make your son carry it. They'll smear you until the word hero tastes like ash in his mouth. They'll make him doubt you." Michael's stomach turned. That was the one wound he couldn't survive. But Rachel wasn't finished. "Or you can stand tall and let him see you endure. That's the only shield that matters. Not medals, not applause, just endurance." He thought of Ethan's drawings on the fridge. Smiling stick soldiers. Flags. A little boy's belief that his father was more than the world said he was. Michael nodded slowly. "Then endurance it is." The hearings came fast. A cold, gray room. A panel of officials in suits and uniforms, their faces carved from stone. They fired questions like bullets. They twisted his words. They accused him of misremembering, of exaggerating, of chasing attention. Michael sat straight, hands folded, voice calm. "I carried men out while others ignored the warnings. You can bury that on paper, but I was there, and I'll carry it whether you admit it or not." The room bristled. Cameras weren't allowed, but word leaked out anyway. The forgotten soldier wasn't backing down. When he came home that night, exhausted, Ethan was waiting at the door. The boy threw his arms around him, fierce for someone so small. "You didn't let them make you invisible, did you?" Michael's throat tightened. He hugged his son close, whispering into his hair, "Not this time, buddy, not ever again." But as he looked over Ethan's shoulder, out the darkened window, he knew the fight was far from over. Truth was out now, but truth never traveled alone. It carried enemies, and enemies were circling. And for the first time in years, Michael Carter wondered if he could survive not the battlefield, but the cost of being heard. How do you protect a child when the war follows you home? Michael Carter had spent years teaching himself that the battlefield was behind him, that the desert's ghosts belonged to another life. But standing in the dim light of his apartment hallway, watching shadows shift beneath his door, he knew the battlefield had simply changed shape. It started small, anonymous calls. A letter slipped under the door with nothing but 2 words: "Stay silent." The SUV at the corner no longer just watched, it followed, to the grocery store, to Ethan's school, to the garage where Michael worked. The first time he saw it, he told himself it was coincidence. By the third day, there was no denying it. He didn't tell Ethan. He didn't want his boy carrying fear the way he did. But children sense what words hide. Ethan stayed close, his laughter dimmer, his eyes darting more. Then came the night of the break-in. It was after midnight. Michael was half asleep on the couch when the faintest sound pulled him awake, a click, a scrape at the lock. His chest tightened. His body moved on instinct before his mind caught up. He was on his feet, heart pounding, silent. The door creaked open. 2 figures slipped inside, dark silhouettes moving with practiced precision. They weren't burglars. Their posture was too deliberate, their silence too sharp. Michael's pulse roared in his ears. Ethan. He moved before they reached the hallway. Years of training came back in a flood: control the space, strike first, strike fast. He lunged, grabbing the nearest man, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the frame. The second swung at him, a shadow in the dim. Michael blocked, twisted, drove his elbow back with a bone-jarring crack. The fight was fast, messy, silent. His limp slowed him, but rage carried him through. When it was over, one man lay groaning on the floor, clutching a broken wrist, the other scrambling out the door, vanishing into the night. Michael stood in the wreckage, chest heaving, fists trembling. Then a small voice froze him in place. "Dad." Ethan stood in the hallway, hair tousled, eyes wide with fear. Michael's heart shattered. He forced his voice calm. "It's okay, buddy, it's over." But the lie burned. It wasn't over, it was just beginning. By morning, the SUV was gone, but Michael knew better. Whoever had sent those men wasn't finished. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about control. Rachel Donovan arrived within hours, storming into the apartment like she had been waiting for the call. She took in the broken lock, the overturned lamp, the faint smear of blood on the wall. Her jaw clenched. "They crossed the line," she said. Her voice shook, not with fear but with fury. Michael's hands were still raw from the fight. He flexed them, the old ache in his knee flaring. "You think this ends with me standing at a podium? It won't. They'll keep coming until I shut up or disappear." Rachel stepped closer, her eyes burning with the fire of command. "Then don't disappear. Stand louder. They want you invisible. You can't give them that, not now." Michael laughed bitterly. "Easy for you to say. You've got security, an army. All I've got is a kid who can't sleep because he watched men break into our home." Her face softened, just for a breath. "You think I don't know what that feels like? To watch the world close in on your family, to wonder if the fight you're in is worth the price." Michael said nothing. Rachel's voice dropped low, steady. "The only thing that makes the price worth it is showing them you won't break, not for yourself, not even for truth, but for him." She glanced toward Ethan's room. The words landed like a weight Michael couldn't shake. That night Michael sat awake at the kitchen table, Ethan asleep on the couch beside him, unwilling to be left alone. The city hummed outside, but in the silence of his apartment, Michael realized something. He wasn't just fighting for truth anymore. He was fighting for Ethan's future. The hearings resumed the next week. This time, the questions cut deeper, sharper. Officials accused him of undermining national security, of smearing good men's names. They painted him as bitter, broken, unreliable. Michael sat still, steady, his voice calm. "I buried brothers because orders were ignored. I won't bury the truth with them." But the attacks weren't limited to the hearing room anymore. The media dug into his past, his discharge papers, his injury, his finances. They painted him as unstable, a failed soldier clinging to relevance. Michael tried to shield Ethan from it. But one evening the boy came home from school, fists clenched, eyes red. "They said you were a liar," he burst out, tears brimming. "They said you made it all up, that you're not a hero." Michael's breath caught. He knelt, gripping his son's shoulders. "Ethan, listen to me. People will say things when they're scared, but you know me, you know what I did, and that's enough." Ethan's lip trembled. "But are you telling the truth?" Michael's heart broke at the question. He pulled his son close, voice rough. "Yes, always, I will never lie to you." Ethan pressed his face against his father's chest. "Then I don't care what they say." Michael held him tighter, eyes stinging. That small voice gave him more strength than any medal ever had. But strength didn't erase the fear. That night after Ethan finally slept, Michael stood on the porch staring at the quiet street. His mind replayed the break-in, the whispers, the threats. He had been a soldier once. He knew what came next. Escalation. The truth was out now, and it was louder than ever. But shadows were louder too. Michael's phone buzzed with another blocked number. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He already knew what it would say. Silence or loss. He closed his eyes, breathing slow, steady. For years he had been invisible. Now, for the first time, he understood the cost of being seen. The question wasn't whether he could endure it. The question was whether Ethan could. And in that moment, Michael Carter made a vow in his chest, sharp as steel. If the war had followed him home, he would fight it, not for glory, not for recognition, but for his son. What happens when the system built to honor you decides to destroy you instead? The hearings dragged on like slow torture. Michael Carter sat under the fluorescent lights, the air heavy with suspicion. Questions cut sharper than bullets. The men in suits twisted his words, replayed fragments of his testimony, turned his truths into weapons against him. "You admit you disobeyed orders." "I carried men out when others would have left them," Michael replied evenly. "You admit you were injured and unstable." "I was broken, but I still fought to bring them home." "You admit you've spoken against command decisions in the past." "Yes, because those decisions killed good men." His voice never rose, but the room bristled with hostility. To the panel, Michael wasn't a witness anymore. He was the accused. And outside, the storm raged louder. News anchors dissected his life like it was a puzzle to be solved. Pundits debated whether he was a patriot or a traitor. Old photos surfaced, Michael in uniform, Michael limping off a transport, Michael holding a folded flag. Each image twisted into whatever narrative fit the day. Rachel Donovan fought for him in public, standing at podiums, her voice ringing with steel. But even she was under fire. Opponents accused her of politicizing a veteran's pain. Allies whispered that she had gone too far, tied herself too tightly to a man they could erase. "Do you regret it?" one journalist shouted at her. Rachel's reply was firm. "I regret nothing. A nation that salutes its generals but silences its soldiers has already lost its honor." The words struck like thunder, but thunder was followed by storm. Rachel's approval ratings dipped. Her enemies circled. Michael knew she was risking everything by standing beside him. And then came the moment that broke him. He had tried to shield Ethan from the news, the whispers at school, the looks from neighbors. But children aren't blind. One evening, Michael found his son sitting alone in his room, crayon drawings torn, little hands trembling. "They said you're lying," Ethan whispered, "that you're making everything up." Michael's heart shattered. He knelt, reaching for his son. "Buddy, look at me." Ethan's eyes were wet, confused. "Are you lying?" Michael's throat closed. He pulled Ethan close, pressing his forehead against his son. His voice was raw. "No, I am not lying. Every word I said was the truth. But truth scares people. And when people are scared, they say things that aren't fair." Ethan clung to him, small body shaking. "I don't want them to take you away." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. They won't, not as long as I'm here. But when he tucked Ethan into bed that night, Michael's chest burned with the weight of the promise. Because promises were fragile, and the shadows outside their window were growing darker. The next day, Michael received a message that changed everything. It was slipped into his mailbox, unsigned. A single sheet of paper with just one line scrawled across it. Protect your boy. Stop before it's too late. No threats, no demands, just that sentence, and it chilled him more than anything else. He showed it to Rachel when she came by that evening. She read it, her jaw tightening, her hands steady. They're trying to break you through him. They know you won't bend for yourself, so they'll make you bend for Ethan. Michael's fists clenched. Then maybe I should stop. Rachel's eyes snapped to his, sharp as a blade. If you stop, they win. They bury the truth forever, and your son grows up thinking silence is strength. Michael's voice cracked. What good is truth if it costs him his safety? Rachel stepped closer, lowering her voice. What good is safety if it costs him your dignity? The words cut him to the bone. He turned away, staring at the wall, struggling to breathe. That night sleep wouldn't come. He sat at the kitchen table again, the glow of the laptop lighting his face. Headlines blared. His name trended. Supporters chanted. Critics cursed. His son slept fitfully in the other room, innocence caught between truth and fear. Michael buried his face in his hands. He wasn't afraid for himself anymore. He'd lived through worse. He was afraid for the boy. The next morning, Rachel called him to the Capitol. The meeting room was stark, empty except for her and a folder on the table. They're going to escalate, she said quietly. We've intercepted chatter. They're painting you as a security threat. Once that label sticks, they can justify anything. Arrest, silence, worse. Michael's jaw locked, and Ethan. Rachel's eyes flickered. Collateral. The word hit like a hammer. Michael's chest heaved. His voice dropped heavy with steel. Then tell me what to do. Rachel pushed the folder toward him. Inside were documents, sealed transcripts, names redacted in black ink. Proof that his report wasn't just his word, it was part of a bigger truth. You don't have to stand alone, she said. Others are ready, but someone has to take the first step. Michael stared at the folder, his hands trembling. The weight of it was unbearable. When he got home that night, Ethan was waiting with a small notebook in hand. The boy had drawn again, stick figures this time, holding hands, standing under a flag. But this one was different. The tallest figure had a shield in one hand, standing in front of the smaller one. That's you, Ethan said simply. You always stand in front. Michael's throat closed. He gathered his boy into his arms, silent tears burning. The choice was in front of him now. To stop and protect Ethan from the storm, or to keep standing in the fire, knowing it could consume them both. He had been invisible once. He had lived in silence, but now the world was watching. And Michael Carter knew one thing with unshakable certainty. If his son believed he stood in front, then he would. Even if it meant facing the fire alone. What happens when the storm finally breaks? Michael Carter didn't sleep the night before the hearing. He sat on the edge of his bed, the folder Rachel had given him lying on the nightstand like a loaded weapon. Ethan slept down the hall, his breathing steady, his small body wrapped in the safety of dreams. Michael envied him. Dreams had always been kinder than waking. Dawn came gray and heavy. The city outside seemed to hold its breath. Reporters already swarmed the courthouse. Headlines screamed predictions, hero or traitor, commander-in-chief under fire, forgotten soldier faces reckoning. Michael buttoned his faded jacket slowly, his hands steady now. Fear had burned itself out. What remained was something harder, resolve. Rachel met him at the steps, surrounded by aides, but her eyes found his instantly. She looked tired, worn by the weight of both nation and conscience, but the steel was still there. She placed a hand briefly on his arm. "You ready?" she asked. Michael's voice was low, calm. "I don't know if ready is the right word, but I'm here." She nodded, "Then that's enough." Inside, the room was colder than the desert ever had been. A panel of officials sat high, looking down, their expressions carved from stone. Cameras lined the back. This session wasn't behind closed doors anymore. The world was watching. Michael sat, the folder heavy in his lap. He could feel Rachel's presence behind him, steady, unyielding. For once, he wasn't alone. The questions came fast, sharp. "Staff Sergeant Carter, are you prepared to admit that your memory is unreliable?" "No." "Are you prepared to admit that you disobeyed orders?" "I disobeyed." Silence. "Are you prepared to admit that releasing classified reports has endangered lives?" Michael's jaw clenched. He opened the folder, laying the papers flat on the table. The only lives endangered were the ones left to die because warnings were ignored. The only danger here is truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd as cameras zoomed in. Reporters scribbled furiously. One official leaned forward, his voice cutting. "You think this is about truth? This is about loyalty." Michael's eyes burned with quiet fire. Loyalty to what? To lies, to silence. My loyalty was to the men beside me, to the ones who didn't make it home. You can erase me from your reports, but you can't erase them from my memory. The room erupted in whispers. The panel shifted uncomfortably. Rachel stood then, her voice ringing like a blade drawn from its sheath. "What you call disloyalty, I call duty. This man did what command failed to do. He saved lives when orders abandoned them. If that is treason, then every soldier who carries another out of fire is guilty too." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, the officials on the panel looked uncertain. Michael's chest ached, not from fear, from release. Years of silence, of invisibility, finally cracking. The hearing dragged on for hours. Accusations flew. Documents were read aloud. But by the end, one truth remained unshaken. Michael hadn't come for fame. He hadn't come for revenge. He had come because silence was crushing him, and his son deserved to see him stand, not bow. When it was over, the crowd outside roared. Some cheered, some shouted insults, but all of them saw him. That night back at the apartment, Michael sat on the porch with Ethan curled against his side. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with questions too big for his years. "Dad, are you in trouble?" Michael hesitated, then kissed the top of his son's head. "Sometimes telling the truth looks like trouble, buddy, but it is. It's just hard." Ethan thought about that for a long moment. "Did you win?" Michael's chest tightened. He looked out at the night sky, the stars hidden by the city's glow. Winning wasn't the right word, but there was something else. "I didn't win," he said softly, "but I didn't quit, and sometimes that's enough." Ethan nestled closer, content with the answer. Rachel called later. Her voice was quiet, heavy. "You did more today than most men ever will. Whatever happens next, you've already changed the story." Michael looked at his sleeping son, his small hand gripping his father's sleeve even in dreams. "I didn't change the story," he whispered. "I just refused to let them write the ending for me." After the call, he sat in silence. For years, he had lived invisible, buried under the weight of shame and silence. But now the world knew his name. Whether they called him hero or traitor didn't matter. What mattered was that Ethan knew the truth. The days that followed were chaos. Some demanded his arrest. Some demanded his honor. Strangers sent letters, some filled with hate, others with gratitude. But Michael no longer flinched at either. Because dignity didn't live in applause. It lived in endurance. One evening, Ethan came running home from school, clutching a crumpled paper. "Look, Dad," he beamed. It was a drawing, this time of a soldier standing tall, saluted by a crowd. Above it, in a child's messy handwriting, were the words, "My dad doesn't quit." Michael's throat tightened, eyes burning. He pulled his boy close, holding him like a promise. And in that moment, For the first time, he understood something simple. Being a hero wasn't about medals or headlines or even salutes. It was about standing when silence tried to crush you. It was about refusing to disappear. And sometimes, it was about letting a child see you endure so they never forget how. Michael Carter sat back, his son safe in his arms, the world roaring beyond their walls. And he felt peace. Because sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.